you can hear any of us, raise your hands.
Hello? Hello? You hear me? Ready?
No, you speak.
Hello?
Yeah, big man.
Calm me down, shall we?
Friends, welcome to day 2 of the 2023 WTO Public Forum. We launched it well yesterday, and we certainly plan to continue on that high. In a few minutes, the forum's first high-level panel will start, focusing on synergies between policy and practice. Let's hear from top-notch business, political, and societal leaders on what it takes to uncover practical solutions for a more sustainable future. But to kick off, we get to listen to a message of Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar on the leadership required to tackle climate issues through global cooperation. After that, Raj will take over. So we get a video now, in a couple of seconds. Thank you.
Good morning from Government Buildings here in Dublin. It's an honour to address this year's World Trade Organization Public Forum. Climate change is the single greatest threat facing humanity today, and I believe that we must be the generation that turns the tide on it. As your theme rightly says, it's time for action. Like partners all around the world, the Irish government is working hard to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees, aiming to halve our emissions by 2030 and reach net zero no later than 2050. Ireland has a sea area that is 7 times bigger than our landmass, and we're home to some of Europe's best wind speeds. So developing our offshore wind energy capacity will over time eliminate our dependence on imported fossil fuels and allow Ireland to achieve energy independence within a generation. Ireland has long supported open, fair, rules-based trade as the best way to secure prosperity for the greatest number of people around the world. To be fair and sustainable, trade must be about more than jobs and growth and income, important as they are. It must also have regards to the goals that we've set ourselves as a global community through the COP process. Without open trade, we will not secure our ambitions for developing the green economy in areas such as offshore wind energy, climate tech, and sustainable food. These ambitions require a vast array of low or no carbon goods and services supported by global value chains and open international markets. Trade is therefore an indispensable part of climate action. Colleagues, we need to work together to save our planet. National strategies alone cannot be sufficient. Global challenges need global solutions. So I believe the WTO is ideally placed to develop the global agenda on how trade can be a force for good in the fight against climate change. It can also help us find solutions that better integrate trade policies with our shared climate objectives and that can incentivize societies to adopt low carbon practices and promote sustainable supply chains. That's why this week's public forum is so important. And I wish you well in your deliberations and in continuing to shape an ambitious trade agenda and environmental agenda at the WTO. Thank you very much.
Good morning. How about now? I want to thank the WTO and all the organizers of this public forum. And to just piggyback a little bit on the words that we heard from the Irish Prime Minister, there are a number of technical issues at play here. And I know this room is filled with technical experts on trade and on development. And I know those of you who are following us online around the world on social media platforms and on the live stream bring your own expertise to this debate. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that all of us as human beings are experiencing these issues in a very deep and personal way right now. We're here in Switzerland, certainly in Europe this summer. There have been a number of natural disasters. The heat has been intense and very notable. But you could tell the same story about many, many parts of the world. I don't think there's anyone who's unaffected. And so while these are issues that are technical in nature, they're also very personal. And so I really applaud the WTO for bringing these issues together to this stage. And Dr. Ngozi, the Director General, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Those of us at DevEx, where I'm the Editor-in-Chief, know Dr. Ngozi well because we cover all things global development. And I think if there's a shift in recent years, it has been that trade and development are now seen as so inextricably linked. These two things work together. So if we want to address the fact that some 20 to 60 million people every year now are displaced by weather events, by climate, just now. If we want to look ahead to a future that is brighter, we need to consider how trade and development can be aligned, and particularly on this issue of climate action. So we have an incredible group of panelists we're going to have this discussion with, but I just want to tell you a quick story before we dive in. I was earlier this year in Medellin, Colombia, and I met someone who's probably similar to a lot of the experts and leaders in this room, a young person, a social entrepreneur who started a company to convert gas-guzzling cars into electric vehicles. And his view is that in places like Medellin, it's less likely that people will have the resources to just get rid of their current gas-guzzling car and buy an electric. That may happen in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, but in many low and middle-income countries, there will be a transition. And so he is working to take existing cars and take out the gas motor and put it in a battery, and he finds that it's very challenging to do. The lithium comes from his continent, but the batteries are produced on the other side of the world. The engineers to develop the car are there, they're local. He has trained people, but the motors have to come from another continent away. And so this young social entrepreneur trying to make climate action in his own way happen in one of the most air polluted cities in the world, in Medellin, he finds that he's stymied by trade. And so these issues, trade and development and how you connect them to climate action, are pretty fundamental wherever you look. When you get away from the high level policy discussion, it's a real thing in real people's lives every day. So I'm so glad that we brought this to the stage today. And I'm really delighted to welcome the expert panelists we have to talk about these issues. Immediately to my left is Borge Brende, who's of course the president of the World Economic Forum. So wonderful to have you here. And I'm sure everyone knows you, but may not know you are the former Minister both of Foreign Affairs and of Trade of Norway.
And environment.
And environment. So we could not have anyone better on this panel today. We have Minister Daniel Lagarde, who is the Minister of Foreign Trade, as well as a number of other portfolios in Ecuador. And importantly for the discussion today, he is also the co-chair of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate. Thank you, Daniel, for being here. And next to him, we have Minister Kiesel Peters, who is the Minister of Foreign Trade for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. She is also a member of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate. We'll hear a bit more about that later on. Jesper Bruden is with us. He is the CEO of Inca Group, or IKEA, and he is a co-chair of another alliance that we should mention, the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders. We'll hear a bit more about that as well. Thanks for being here, Jesper. And Kirsten Schwitt, who is the Director General of the WWF International. She herself is a conservation expert and has spent her career dedicated to these issues. So this is an incredible group to have this conversation with today. And I thought maybe I could just start off opening the floor and maybe going to you, Borge, because I think the natural reaction many people will hear, and not just because I live in Washington, D.C., where trade is a very political issue. I think it is probably everywhere in the world. But the natural reaction that people might have when they hear trade and climate is that these are opposing ideas, that trade is the problem, that, you know, we have to, as an example of the young social entrepreneur in Medellin, we have to ship things around the world, and that creates a lot of emissions, and in a sense, it's trade that's causing the climate problem that we live with today. Explain how you see these issues, coming from that background that you do, but also understanding so well the forces behind the private sector that you do at the WEF.
Thank you very much. And I think we have to admit that there are. Thank you very much. Thanks for that critical question. I think we have to admit that there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs between growth, trade, and also climate. My view is that when it comes to the decarbonization that we will need to see globally, the net zero, it also needs to be a tripling of renewables in the coming decade. And we know that this is about also having access to the new technologies, to solars, to wind. And I think on the trade side, it is very important that we don't have unnecessary barriers that keep those products not being exported or imported. If we met 10 years ago and I said that the price of solar would fall to 1/10 and the price of wind would fall to 1/7, I think most people would say, oh, that guy is a bit optimistic or blue-eyed. But that's not the reality. Most places in the world, the renewables are more competitive than any of the fossil fuels without any subsidies. This would not have happened if we could not export and import, for example, solar panels and wind turbines. We need the market to flow in the interest also of mitigating CO2 emissions. And today there are a lot of barriers. There are a lot of red tape, but there's also a lot of tariffs. People and countries put a lot of tariffs on these new technologies, and then it's more expensive for those that want to roll it out. So here I think trade can be an agent for change when it comes to climate. But of course, we have to decouple growth in the economy, economic growth, growth in trade, from growth in CO2 emissions. That's why in the future, shipping has to be much greener. In the future, we also have to internalize the externalities. You have to pay the price for what you're really doing. So if you're exporting green, you should have zero tariffs. If you're exporting things that are harming the nature, then I'm in favor of tariffs. You know, maybe that's a good thing, but that it should be in the context of internalizing the externality.
It's a great point. If you saw a chart of, trade and global economic growth and CO2, they're probably highly correlated, and you're saying we have to break that. I wonder, Kiesel, if I can go to you, because you're a minister from a small country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so the point that Borge is making is that, look, a country of your scale may not be able to have renewable energy technologies if not for trade.
Yes.
Is that how you see it from your perspective? How do you see this trade-off when you think of trying to make the energy transition happen inside your country?
Well, we have been trying very hard to make that transition. I think developing countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we recognize it's important because climate change and the environmental impact which it causes, it's an existential threat for countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we have been making that extra push as it relates to renewable energy. We've been looking at solar energy. We've been investigating geothermal energy. There are other countries across the region who have been investing in wind turbine energy. And it's very important for us to do this because I don't know if I could put into words how important it is.
For you, it's existential because you're an island nation.
And I've said it before. And it is a very important push. But one of the points I usually make is that when we try to harness this new green energy, there's a cost. Everything has a cost. And countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, with a small economy, it is very difficult for us. And then it now leads to the question of financing and how we are able to acquire this new type of energy. And I'm very happy that the WTO has had this public forum because it gives us the opportunity to have focused discussions on these issues. So I say that we have to focus the discussions, and we have to look at ways in which developing countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines can benefit from this type of technology.
Right. Right. I think back to my original framing, it's very easy for people, especially in a political environment, to talk about trade is good or trade is bad. And I think what we're hearing already from your intervention and from Borges is it's much more nuanced than that. It's a question of how are we designing the trade regime? What is the framework? What are the policies that will lead us to the result we want to see? And maybe, Kirsten, we can turn to you on the very same question, which is when you think about the trade regime as it exists today, global trade is, as Borges mentioned, associated with rising climate emissions. How do we decouple? Do you see that as a possibility in the near term, given the urgency of what we're dealing with? How would we achieve it?
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me? Yeah. I think what's really important is we're talking here about climate change, but I think, and you're already talking about it before, is that we should be speaking about the environment. Because it's climate change, but it's nature and biodiversity as well. Secondly, I think we should also stop thinking that the economy or let's say the socioeconomic system is separate from the natural system. We're all intertwined. In fact, I think the natural system, the environment, is at the basis of the economic system. So there's already your answer. I think, of course, trade plays a hugely important role, but it's not whether we should have trade or not trade. I think it's what kind of trade do we want. And also being at this forum, I think it's also asking the question, what role does organizations like WTO want to play in championing a different future? And so I think that's the kind of conversation that we need to have. How can we design trade in such a way that it's a force for good, as you were saying as well, Borge, as opposed to a force for, for destruction, which often it is in the case in the world in which we currently live, both from a climate change perspective and a biodiversity perspective. We're losing biodiversity in every single place we care about. How can we change the systems in our world? And again, the trade system is a hugely important one, so that it becomes a force for good.
Minister Daniel, maybe I can come to you. I imagine many trade ministers, when you are inside your government thinking about your immediate needs, are worrying about things like job creation, right? Economic growth. You are now co-chairing this group of ministers of trade thinking about climate. Do those things go together? Do you find that you are being pulled in two different directions when you have, let's say, a cabinet meeting inside your country?
Well, thank you again, Raj, Director General, and all my colleagues here. I think you're putting me in the spotlight here because it's kind of the key question, and all my colleagues here have developed the right questions and the right concerns about it. But as you said, if we want to make changes to the real people, life in life, like the example you made in Medellin, I think it needs to go alongside also with the political will. And this is the main objective of the Coalition of Trade Ministers on Climate. It's creating the political will, because it's not the first time that climate is bring to the table of the WTO, but it is the first time that this level is taking place on ministers of trade, taking also the discussion and taking the challenges on the discussion on trade and climate. There's still a long way to go, but definitely what we want to stress out is mainly the political will of taking these steps towards. There's other examples that have been already taking place in different manners. There's the coalition for finance ministers, and it's a long way ahead of us, I would say. But trade cannot be lag behind, cannot be leave behind. So the discussions that we will be having and the support that we will be making to the Climate Committee and to the WTO debates, I think it's worth the shot, especially because, as it has been mentioned, all these concerns have to take place. It's not a discussion about whether we want trade or not. It's how can we make trade to be an enabler of a better climate policy in all the world, and specifically in the policy level, that we can stress out not only in the multilateral level, but also in initiatives that can be regional or as a country level. as well. So this is the main objective that we want to bring to the table. As I said, there's still a long way to work on this, but we think that we can make an important impact in creating a strong and debate, and of course bring to the table all conscious minds, but also the support from technical advisors and institutions.
And there probably would have been a time, maybe just a few years ago, when we would have had a conversation like this, Minister, and said, yeah, there is a trade-off between jobs today and a better climate in the future. But now it's right now. I mean, certainly in the Andean region, you have many climate refugees because of the reduction in water resources in the mountains, and you can see it visibly in the cities, how many people have left and are continuing to leave because of the climate that's changing right now in front of our eyes. So it's not such a long versus short-term kind of trade-off like it might have been in the past.
No, it's happening, definitely. It's happening right now. And again, this is about how we can balance the table between the dialogues on trade and the dialogues on climate change, the things that need to be held up together. And we want to make sure also as trade ministers not to lose out this perspective of trade, because it should be on the table. It's very important for creating jobs, for creating investment, for a better future for our societies. But of course, it needs to be taken into account also the challenges on climate change that are happening in our own countries, in our own sectors, in our own regions, and also in terms of the future of the world and the warnings that we already have for this future.
Jesper, I'd love to bring you into the discussion. I think when everybody knows IKEA, so we don't need to introduce IKEA, but people know IKEA.
Please do.
They know IKEA for maybe two things. One is beautiful but impronounceable furniture.
Correct.
But also for environmental stewardship. This has been part of your DNA from the very beginning, right? Looking at how you can better use recycled materials or low carbon content materials. But I wonder if you could kind of address the fundamental contradiction that Borge brought up right at the start. This idea that, you know, our global economy is geared toward growth, growth, growth. You know, buy more furniture, buy more things, ship it around the world. And can we continue in that route, even if we try to be more environmentally responsible about the way we do it? Are we just on the wrong path, kind of a path over the cliff here? Or is there a way we can actually decouple, to use Borge's term?
So thank you. First of all, I think listening to us this moment, it's also, I think for all of us, a deeply emotional topic. We talk about existentialistic issues. This is not about one-dimensional trade-offs between economic growth and so forth. This is something, I think, much deeper for humanity, really. And we have an opportunity, and I believe all of us on the stage, maybe all of us listening into this call have accepted that, even if we don't have all the answers. This is our generation's deepest, maybe, responsibility to contribute to. Now, I think there are a couple of real myths that we should bust, basically. It's time to get them out of the way. Because they basically, if we allow them to be there, they're going to stop us from taking the right actions going forward. So if I look at IKEA as a trailblazer in sustainability, for ethical reasons, for brand reasons, each one of those would be, I think, motivational enough, but also truly for economic reasons. So I simply have difficulties to understand the narrative that being climate smart would be nothing else than resource smart and thereby cost smart. Of course, when we go deeper into the conversations, there are barriers. I'm here also representing the Climate Alliance, WEF Climate Alliance, where we have come to realize that we need to collaborate with public sectors much more in order to help us to set the stage for the new economy that we are transforming into, so that we do the right investments, not in 5 years or 10 years, but we can do them now. But if you look at IKEA, since Paris Agreement, we have grown by 24.6%. We have an absolute reduction of carbon by 13.8%. Not
you have decoupled
relative,
in that sense.
Not relative. It's absolute reduction. Yeah. We have an SBTi goal that we set basically in the wake of Paris of -15 for 2030. Since then, science has developed and is asking us to do -50, which is what we're basically working as the current target level. But the interesting thing is that is at least one of the proofs that it seems that economic growth and decoupling of carbon is a very good business idea. And I would like to introduce that is the new economy. And if that's not true, then all of us need to hurry up to set the stage for that to be true in the spaces where it's still not.
I mean, is it as simple as we need a global carbon tax? Like, are we over-complexifying the issue? If you simply could take away that externality and apply it to the price, would that solve everything? Or do you think at the end of the day, this is a much more nuanced and complex picture?
Well, I think I have an opinion, but I think my friends on the stage here have probably more knowledge in that. But I do, building on what Börje was saying, I think definitely the tool of taxation or tariffs should be used and used wisely. But I do believe it's a matter of shifting also. We have still in this world incredible amounts of subsidies on the old economy. I'm not only referring to oil and gas subsidies, but if you look at and here we need to have some patience with humanity, if you like, because there are subsidies put on, for instance, incineration of waste that was put there in order to avoid landfill. So there was a good purpose way back in the 1900s. Today, that is absolutely destructive to the opportunity of creating a circular economy. So thereby, we're inviting fellow public sector to help us remove those subsidies and put them into circularity instead. Actually, recently in IKEA, the last years, we worked together with the Dutch government and the recycling company to not only take back IKEA's share, but actually all mattresses in Netherlands to see if it was possible to create a circular business model where consumption as such is actually at the core addressed. And today we have invested in 4 reverse factories taking care of all the mattresses in Netherlands. We couldn't have done that unless the government of Netherlands shifted the policies and then endorsed legislation that means people need to drop their mattresses in collection points. We haven't asked for subsidies. We didn't need that. It's still a good business case. So you see, this example and many more already exist that is telling us that it is actually economically smart to collaborate and set the stage for the new economy. And that climate net zero is within our reach.
Mm-hmm. I just want to alert everyone here that we are interested in hearing your questions. So start thinking about what those are, and I'll be coming soon to all of you to include you in this discussion. Börje, I wanted to pick up on something Jesper said, which is that it's not just that we're maybe not doing all the right things. We're actively doing some of the wrong things today. We're subsidizing the things that put us in the wrong direction. And of course, there's a political economy around that. As soon as you have a subsidy, you have a coalition around that subsidy. How do you see that issue, given your various experience?
Quite depressing to see that we're using, for example, so much money on subsidizing fossil fuel. We are using more money this year than we did last year, than making fossil fuel cheaper by taking money from people in taxes, and then we use them to then subsidize what you want them to use less. So in many countries, there's no subsidies for the renewables, but then you subsidize coal or heavy oil. And we agreed a decade ago, we even had coalitions for ending subsidies of fossil fuel, but it's still there. But it also shows the complexities because people and their livelihoods, if they need to pay more and they are poor, this is also something that mobilizes the masses. So we could, in a less global, less fractured and polarized world, we could hope for world leaders to come together and say, for example, climate change is a common challenge. The CO2 emissions travel without passports, so we need to agree on some common understandings. And I think, as you referred to also, this summer has again shown us that the cost of inaction in the climate area far exceeds the cost of action. So it would be common sense to now take some steps because it's in our interest, but common sense doesn't seem to be that common in this field. That's a challenge. I think we need to move away from this why, because I think we know why, but it's really how. So I would say we should eradicate the next decade all subsidies of fossil fuel. I think we need to find ways of, as I said, paying a kind of price if you do use alternatives that are less environmentally friendly than the alternatives. So we need to incentivize rolling out of the renewables because we need at least a tripling in the coming decade, but even by 2030. Then to make it even more complex is that also the title of this is Trade for a Sustainable Future. And sustainability is about the environment, but it's also about the economy and is the social impact. And you know, trade also has been a driver of growth during the last decades. And it is a fact that you have seen the extreme poverty falling to the lowest ever, even if we have 7 billion people. The last couple of years after COVID, we've seen there are more people living in extreme poverty. So it's the first time it's been growing in 3 decades. So how do we make sure that this transformation from fossil fuel basis of the Industrial Revolution that started more than 200 years ago, the transformation then into a more renewable future can happen also at the same time as we eradicate all extreme poverty by 2030. That is the goal of the SDGs. I think it's possible, but it's more difficult in a polarized world because world leaders don't agree. But you know, the fact, as I said, that renewables now compete and is more competitive than the fossil fuel shows that there are opportunities, but we have to continue to trade, we have to with each other, we have to continue to find common solutions, and we have to price the activities that we don't want more of.
It sounds like we need to decouple economic growth from carbon emissions, but we need to couple poverty reduction with carbon reduction, right? Those two things need to go together. And if I'm understanding you well, it's in part because in order for this transition to realistically happen, we have to bring people and societies along. People have very good reasons if their job is in the fossil fuel industry or their livelihood depends on inexpensive access to fossil fuels. They have very good reason to resist this change otherwise. So it has to be brought together. Kirsten, I'd love to hear your feedback on these.
Yeah, no, I was just reflecting on what was said and also just want to give an example of something that has happened within the WTO of a shift that was actually quite significant, which is actually the work on the fisheries subsidies, which I think to many of us is a great example of exactly what you were talking about, of changing within the system, shifting harmful subsidies and harmful incentives to something that's very positive. And I really want to commend the people who've worked, and I know Ngozi, you've been a big champion of this, of working on this. And how wonderful it will be is if we can also look at some of the other supply chains and how we can improve that. And I think a great example as well is agriculture, right? If you look at the specifics of food production, which is a large part of our export system and our economic system, 80% of the production of, 80% of deforestation is linked to the production of food. So just focusing on shifting the subsidies on food production, which I know is a major task, but would have a major impact on climate change and on biodiversity conservation. And so I think looking at the example of what we've done with fisheries subsidies and applying that along other topics like food production, I think would be a great example of what we can do globally to improve trade for the better of the world.
It could also have a big impact on human health, right? As Jesper was saying, these are not one-dimensional issues. And if you think about the way our agricultural production system has been designed to date, it's really incented toward yield. Maximize the number of calories you can produce. And yet, while we have a historic amount of calories being produced, we actually have a historic hunger crisis in the world today. People may in some cases be getting enough calories, but not enough micronutrients, right? So I say this only to say that what we incentivize through tariffs or through subsidies can be very powerful.
Absolutely.
And can direct entire economic systems. I think maybe Kiesel wanted to come in on some of this.
Yes. Now, as we're on the topic of agriculture, agriculture is one of the major sectors in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and it is very susceptible to climate change. Now, we have recognized since the onset of COVID that supply chains can be disrupted. And as a region, CARICOM is making a push with our program 25 by 25 to reduce our importation bill by 25% by the year 2025. Now, in order to do that, we have to increase production. And one of the things St. Vincent and the Grenadines is doing is to increase our production while at the same time using the green technologies that are available and reaching out to bilateral partners who have that technology. And this brings me to the topic of transfer of technology. Transferring technology to countries and regions like the Caribbean and countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We need to see more of that. So for example, in the TRIPS agreement, there's an article 66.2, I believe, where more developed countries are, it provides that they incentivize the transfer of technology to least developed countries. Now, St. Vincent and the Grenadines is not categorized as a least developed, but we have to look at ways, and this brings in to play the role of the WTO in fostering that environment to allow for the transfer of technology and to investigate and interrogate whether or not more developed countries are in fact transferring the technology to countries like mine to assist us with the sustainability objective to produce more, but at the same time we do it in a sustainable manner for the benefit of the environment. So I would like for us to reflect on that issue, because it's very important. Transfer of technology, technological assistance, and we too want to benefit from all of the technology that is there to help us to have a more sustainable future.
And I should mention that Kiesel is also the chair of the Trade and Economic Development Council of CARICOM. So you're looking at this from a broader Caribbean perspective. And I imagine that a lot of what we've already talked about, tariffs and subsidies, could help alleviate that issue to the extent that bigger economies in the world incent, the kinds of technologies that would make agriculture production much more efficient and less carbon intensive. There's more potential for those things to be traded.
Yes.
But in the first place, if they're not incented, you have a real issue. I guess maybe we can, Daniel, bring you into the discussion a little more now on this idea of where the WTO and other platforms fit in. So we've talked already about the Trade Ministers Alliance. We've talked about the CEOs Alliance. What can these platforms, councils, the WTO itself actually do to make this transformation happen?
Well, thanks again. I think there's a couple of things that we've been discussing on what the platforms can do to achieve, independently from the political or from the aspects that every country is moving forward. First of all, I think it's important, and as the minister has just addressed, agriculture is an important issue and is part of the discussion on climate change. As developing countries, and in Latin America in particular, we also we are very eager to move forward the Doha Agenda, Article 20, and keeping up the pace of the commitments that have been lagging for a long time now. This should be part of the discussion necessarily, because it's part of the climate change, as you just addressed as well, and I think we all are aware of that. We're not talking about eliminating or moving away all the subsidies. I think it's very difficult to do. Borg was just saying about the subsidies on fossil fuels and how countries are trying to move away from it. It's a political issue as well. In Ecuador, there's been government after government, many impulses to withdraw the subsidies. This is a social issue that it's relevant. At some point we will get there, but meanwhile we need to move other things as well. Agriculture is one of them, not only from the perspective of the global subsidies discussion, but also taking into account that the more that we want to strengthen the agricultural regulations in the countries, we need to take care and be very carefully exactly on how we want to assess these new achievements, these new goals, in order not to affect the actual routes that the countries might want to have to also move forward their agriculture exports, their sustainable agriculture export. Let me put an example of this. Ecuador is the main provider of organic products to some markets in the world, including the European Union. And there's been some new regulations on these aspects for agricultural products. Some of them are okay, and there's no problem complying with them. In some of others, there's some discussions going on because we want to make sure that to comply with these new challenges, there's not an affection on specifically how can they get to market. If not, we will be creating the opposite effect of, you would say, disencouraging sustainable and organic products in this case by not achieving the standards that they want to get. So we want to make sure that this is an important topic, that it's discussed and well balanced between environment and trade. But again, I was saying that also countries need to move forward in what they can do, and there's more social cohesion to move forward in a political agreement. And Ecuador has been doing that in many terms, and this could be also bring to the table as some examples. For example, in fisheries, and this goes also toe-to-toe to what's been told on the fisher subsidies agreement. We have managed to implement an extent of our Galapagos reserve. For those who doesn't know, the Galapagos Islands, it's a national reserve, and the government took the right option to expand this national reserve for about 7 million hectares, which is a lot. And this comes with an effort from the fishing industry in the country as well. They're giving up resources in that specific area, but with a bigger objective of conservation, in this case for the conservation of the Galapagos Island. This has been a political decision that has more cohesion inside the country, and it's easier to move forward and show the world that it's something that can be done. And again, as I said, this goes toe-to-toe with the agreement on subsidies. But it's one of the examples that can be brought to the table and how we can manage to have actions that must be transmitted at some point to these positions in multilateral agreements or at least some plurilateral agreements.
And it's a good example to me because it brings up the fact that if you don't have global agreements, you end up with a race to the bottom, because Ecuador might do the right thing. It might protect the Galapagos, its heritage, and expand the area. It might have a sustainable fisheries approach and an organic farming approach that makes great sense for climate and the environment. But if it puts you at a disadvantage because other countries say, well, we don't need to follow those practices, and we can therefore sell and take your market, then we'll be racing in the wrong direction.
Exactly.
I do want to go to questions, but Borja, I'd like to hear your quick take on this.
No, I just wanted to shortly follow up on those coalitions, because I think they're very consequential and they can also be inspiring, and it's walking the talk. Jesper mentioned he was a part of this coalition formed in 2014, CO leaders for climate, and I think there are like 122 companies now, Fortune 200-300 companies, all committing to go net zero by 2050. And they're also pushing the envelope all the time. And that inspires hopefully then governments and also other companies. Also, I was very pleased when the ministers in Davos, the trade ministers, agreed to have trade ministers for climate. You know, trade ministers used to be a little bit, and I probably was too when I was trade minister, a little bit one-trick pony on economic growth. But, you know, trade ministers also thinking about the trade-offs, and trade ministers for climate. I think like it's amazing news. And we at Glasgow formed a coalition that I'm also believing very strongly in. It's this First Movers Coalition. It's now 88 companies, all of them Fortune 500, that has said that we will create a green demand in the future. So we use our procurement power, like the Apples, Amazons of the world, and say, we will then buy products that are greener. So if we're going to buy aluminum, 25% of the aluminum has to be produced green. And then you can have all those saying, oh, tariffs, this is border adjustment tax. No, these are a private company saying we will only buy if it's like that. So it's up to them to decide this, and then they're creating a demand. I think while we're waiting for political breakthroughs. Hopefully they will come, inshallah. But I think it's very important that we form more coalitions that are so committed and showing the way. I think that's also a way to show to governments that they need to move faster.
As we discussed at the last World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos, the corporate procurement is a very powerful tool, and it can be used for things like climate and also for inclusive growth, to bring in marginalized communities, indigenous producers, women producers into the economy when they're excluded. And that can have an enormous effect, as you say, well beyond just the international trade system. I know we have an amazing group of expertise and leaders in this room, so I want to give you a chance to ask some questions. I see a few hands. We'll take 3 questions now, and I will ask that they have question marks at the end, please, and to be brief, so we have as much time as possible for discussion. So the first one is here, then we'll take one in the very back of the room, and then this one, and I promise we'll come back later for others. I know there's other hands.
Thank you very much. My name is Belen Gracia. I'm a PhD candidate at Maastricht University and also Director of Editorial Content at Trade Experts. I'm originally from Argentina, and it's a pleasure to have heard this amazing panel. So my question is for Minister Daniel Lagarde. I know that Ecuador is not only chairing the coalition of trade ministers and climate, but it has also been playing a leading role in the negotiations of the plastic treaty. And my question focuses on trade and the circular economy, following the example that Jesper Borden from IKEA gave regarding public-private partnerships to better address the need for more circular trade. I wonder if the Minister can share how governments in the region in Latin America can also promote public-private partnerships to transition to an inclusive circular economy and circular trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll take the one in the very back, the very back.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to the distinguished panelists and for you, to the moderator, Mr. Kumar. And I'm very glad that you mentioned my country and my family city in your introductory remarks. My name is Gustavo Guarin. I come from Colombia, and I am a trade delegate here in Geneva. So you mentioned a very important remark with regard like the issue of trade, right? So why these entrepreneurs have to import the battery, the lithium battery, from somewhere else? Well, the answer is very simple, right? Fair enough, we have to import it, right? And that in contrast with some other members that provide millions and billions of dollars in subsidies on these type of batteries. So to give an example, the U.S. provide per year $1 billion of subsidies to the production of lithium batteries. So what we need, and as a developing member, so we want to be able to produce them, right? So we need technology, we need transfer of technology, we have capacity, we have enough smart people, and something that we have been realizing in our countries is that intellectual property may be a barrier for accessing to that technology. So my questions to you is with regard the role of intellectual property in the transfer of technology issues. So should we keep protecting intellectual property with regard to this environmental sound technology as traditionally we do it? Do we need more flexibilities? Should we discuss this in the WTO? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then we had the last question. Was it here? Yes.
Thank you very much for this wonderful one. So I'm from Technical University Munich. I'm a researcher and also building voices of Global South, of youth, basically. So my question is to Boge. You make mention of something in terms of internalizing the external and giving tariff to those component of sustainability like panels, giving it a tariff, free tariff, zero tariff, so that people that need it could be able to get it. So, but my question is, what model or advice, or economic model, could you advise to ambassadors coming from extractive industries and extractive countries? What advice can you give them that they could be able to coordinate with the multinationals so that at the end of the day, 98% of the renewable resources could be manufactured within the extractive countries? And also, at the end of the day, they could be able to meet the SDG 9, using the rules of WTO. Thank you very much.
Excellent questions. Thank you very much. And if we have time, we'll come back and try to get a few more as well. Maybe we can start, Borge, with that last question. It's a very provocative and interesting one, right? If you think of a lot of the countries in the world that are heavy producers of extractive products, minerals, oil, and gas, many of them have seen the transition coming, and they have tried to invest in a new kind of economy. The most successful and wealthiest of these countries have really invested heavily in that and trying to diversify. But there's also a number of low-income countries that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels and extractive industries. What do they do in this context? Are they going to end up being importers of batteries and solar panels as the world transitions away from their products, and will they become poor in the end?
And thank you for this critical question. I know it's a question that's also very close to the heart of the Director General, Dr. Ngozi. I would say if we talk about extractive industries, we're talking about the minerals, and keep oil and gas out for a second. These are huge opportunities and they're prerequisites for the new green economy. So for those countries that are big, for example, on lithium and also all the other components that are needed, I think here one needs to sit down with WTO, with the World Bank, with UNCTAD, and think through, are there ways to say that we have these resources, but we also need the factories and the competence built here. Maybe these also countries can come together and set up some rules of the game. And we just have to be very careful that we don't see the big actors that also have now the money to then launch this so-called new industry policies, getting everything then produced even by subsidies that poorer countries don't have even money to do. I think here we need a grand bargain between the developed and the developing and also the emerging markets. I think your point is very well taken. On the fossil fuel, of course, that's a bigger question. Fossil fuel will not end tomorrow. This is a gradual move, and there are hopefully also new technologies that will help us on our way. There's also big differences between coal and natural gas. Natural gas will have to be a bridge for a time moving forward, and hopefully technologies like carbon capture and etc., when you see the price is going down, can also be part of this bridging. So it's extremely complex, but I think we're now being reminded that if we don't move faster, the price for not moving faster far exceeds the price of taking this action. So we are really at the crossroads, as the moderator mentioned at the beginning. Unfortunately, this crossroads comes at a time where we have not seen such a bad atmosphere in the Security Council in the UN. We haven't. I have never, as long as I've been in governmental affairs, been operating in a worse against a worse and more complex global and geoeconomic backdrop. So when there is more need than ever to come together to deal with common challenges, there is more competition and less cooperation. I don't have a silver bullet on that, but I think we just have to try to keep up the pressure to find solutions. And my hope, and that's my last point, my hope that even in such a situation, there will be an understanding that we have to collaborate in common interest on some of the key common global challenges. That's my hope. And for example, after the visit of Secretary Kerry to China, they agreed that on climate change, US and China will work together. I hope that will also be, we will see a result. So some of these key areas we have to identify.
And we will get to all the questions, but let's stay on this theme if we can. And Jesper, I think you wanted to jump in.
Maybe just a short remark also. I think it's interesting, as you said, Börje, we don't maybe have the answer today on what that new world order will be exactly. But I think throughout history, it's the best victories have been the ones where there is only winners. And right now we see a tendency of people reaching out, creating collaborations like the WEF Climate Alliance, but also the Minister Alliance that we're referring to. These are the multipolar new ways of connecting and reaching out. So I do believe parties, political or corporate, has the opportunity to choose to be connected or not. But the world is moving on. And as much as there is sacrifice, there is risks, there is human suffering, this is the new benefit. This is the new economy. These are the new brands, corporates that are being built as we speak. So I think the biggest risk, for instance, in the corporate sector is probably to not be on the train, because being left right now on the station is a huge risk, not only brand-wise, but economical, because as much as you're losing the opportunities of the investments of the future, you're actually, if I look at IKEA, just as an example, 130% invested in renewable energy in scope 1 and 2. It's not only independence, it's economically, of course, an advantage to any competitor. So if you look at it, I think it's also needs to be, I think, discussed that the new world economy that we're shaping is the ones where people will benefit, countries and brands, as much as there is a risk equation, of course.
Yeah, and it's, as you say, for companies, they have to move quickly, they have to get on that train. And I think what our colleague here, the researcher, brought up is that the same applies to countries, perhaps, and it's a much more complex...
Where do you think the new jobs will be? You know, there are new questions, there are difficult questions we need to ask ourselves, but the new economy, I think, is sometimes discussed as mitigation strategy or so on, but I think we're actually seeing the new world order of economy being developed. And I think we need to understand that the old economy, it's time to say goodbye. It's time to actually take more brave steps to transform jobs. And we need to thereby, I think I would like to actually ask Börje that we meet these two groups, because I wasn't aware of the ministry group as well as of course, we have the climate group of corporate leaders, because by collaborating, we will be able to speed up the result together, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, I think you both have said this well, because there is no easy answer to it. In fact, our colleague from Colombia, Gustavo, I think Colombia is a country with a well-diversified economy, but it still receives maybe almost half of government budget from fossil fuels. And so getting that transition is very challenging, right? It's something that can't happen instantly and overnight. But as Börje says, you know, if we're going to be living with fossil fuels for a bit longer, there may be a moment now when if you act with urgency, you can start to transform your economy and not be left behind. I think, Danielle, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, taking that last comment on speed regarding the changes that especially the productive sector, the private sector needs to be doing. And thank you for the question, because that allows me to say in Ecuador, and I would say in many parts of Latin America, in the latest years, the changes have been going out very quickly. Normally, what happens is that the private sector and the enterprises are the ones that lead the way to changes, and then the government and the regulation comes a little bit behind. But on these climate issues, and I would say specifically on circular economy, because that was the exact questions, what has been happening in the last years is at least they're going at the same speed, or maybe I would say even the regulation is going even a little bit faster, which is good to say. In the last years, there's been some changes, like the introduction for the, in the case of Ecuador, the organic law on inclusive and circular economy. Last month, we just launched the regulation regarding this law that creates criteria, mechanism to implement eco-design, sustainable production, consumption, some incentives. We are now discussing, for example, the creation of a national certification on the circular economy. That should be discussed on the next levels to see how this engages with international markets. This is another discussion that could be held also in the Coalition for Trade Ministers on Climate. But my point is changes are going very fast. Hopefully the private sector, the productive sector is going also along the way. There's some industries that are easier to make these changes and adapt to the circular economy regulations and criteria, others that have a more challenging way forward. But I definitely agree that there are some stronger steps that need to be taken into account, and in this case, governments are taking these strong steps. There for sure will be space needed to adapt to this new regulation and this new reality, but at least the political will and the regulation, it's already been there. And this is important because on the opposite discussion of the fossil fuel subsidies, for example, is something that is very difficult to change because they're inner there. But in these new topics and this new reality, it's easier to make changes because there's a coalition inside the country and political will to move forward on that. So we also take advantage of that.
That's what's so promising about examples like Jesper's with mattresses, right? If you can take very visible personal things like that everyone can relate to and show what's possible and create a new market, then you ask the question, why can't we do this for the next product and the next product and the next product? And we need to get into that direction. And we've talked a little bit about the issues around the transition to renewable energies from an economic perspective. But I think Gustavo's question was also about kind of a security perspective in a way, right? That do we want to be in a position, as we learned during COVID, when countries had a hard time accessing life-saving vaccines, and realized that the system, the supply chain, was like a national security issue for them. Do we want to replicate those problems when it comes to renewable energy? And his question is about IP and whether there is an issue there. And Kiesel mentioned this as well in terms of technology transfer. So I thought maybe I'd go to you on this, Kiesel, and then open it up to others. When the WTO is tackling this question, should it and its members be looking at kind of the way the global supply chain is structured for these key renewable energy resources?
I think it should. And I've said before, and I will say again, what we experienced during COVID-19, I don't think it was our best moment as humanity, where countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we were told, you have to wait until we inoculate our population before you can have access to vaccines. It wasn't a good feeling. And what do we tell our nationals when we are being told this by the international community? And I commend the WTO for bringing that question to the fore. And in MC12, we saw where there were negotiations as it relates to the TRIPS waiver. I do believe that when it comes to IP rights, we should have that conversation about waiving some of those rights, as I said before, to allow developing countries and least developed countries to access the necessary technologies. And then it takes me to another point. I'm going to be a little bit naughty, and I'm going to suggest that as the WTO, we also need to look at how we classify countries. So we have LCDs. A country like St. Vincent and the Grenadines is not an LCD. We are grouped with the developing countries. But we are small island developing states. And I'm making the point because all developing countries are not the same. So there are larger countries who are still grouped as a developing country. And there might be reservations on the part of members to allow a waiver of IP rights because a larger developing country may have access to said rights. But at the same time, with the current classification that we have, countries like St. Vincent and the Grenadines is grouped with larger developing countries. And because of that, we are not allowed to access whatever waivers there may be because those countries are in the same group. And I'm throwing it out there that maybe we need to look at reclassifying the countries in the WTO so that we can put the attention where the pain is and where the hurt is, so that countries like mine and regions like the Caribbean and regions like the Pacific, we can have access to this technology unencumbered.
Well, these are small island developing states, but especially with your colleague, Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, no longer on a small stage, very much on a big global stage. And I've had the honor to speak to a number of your colleague ministers from other neighboring countries in CARICOM. And I think the point that they make, as you make, is that now that climate is such a key pillar of the discussion, it's not just sustainable development, but with climate at the forefront, that dimension changes the way we should look at small island developing states, because the risk profile is so much higher. But I just wonder on this question of IP, if anyone else wants to jump in quickly. Go ahead, yes.
Maybe just a short remark. I think it's an incredibly interesting question. I would like to suggest that we start in the other end to identify the critical IP rights and then invite the holders of it to ask them if they're interested to open it up. We have seen in recent 2 decades that more and more companies are actually willing to open up for, worrying less about the competitive situation, but actually opening up to sharing because they're good-hearted. And I've seen that in IKEA, I've seen that in many companies. So I think identify where we need to move, and then let's have a dialogue around what could be done.
Yeah, and I wonder myself how much, to the question, is really IP an issue versus, as Borge brought up right at the start, tariffs and subsidies, which may be a much more powerful driver. And when you have a big economy like the United States that can provide $1 billion in subsidies, that may be much more powerful as a force than whatever IP.
I would say, maybe Raj, I think if we add also the aspect of economy of scale, which to a certain degree I'm very optimistic about the renewable energy because it lends itself to a local application, if you like. But the production, etc., it requires certain scale and scalability in order to make sense. So I think still that leads us back to say that we need a collaborative, a new take on the global collaboration in order for all of us to win.
And I would just add to the discussion the idea of regional trade, because I think if there's one lesson from the COVID crisis and from the vaccine supply chain challenges that is now being applied probably by many of the people in this room, is to think not just about what you can produce inside your own borders, but what you can produce among neighboring countries, so that in a crisis you have other opportunities to source products and you're not reliant only on 1 or 2 major countries in the world. And perhaps that applies to this discussion around renewable energy as well. I wonder if we can go back to the floor and take a few more questions. I think there were some hands on this side of the room we didn't get to. I'm looking at a lot of hands. I know, yes, we'll start with this gentleman here. Then there's a question midway through the room and then toward the end. And if we have time, we'll come to you as well, sir. Please begin.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here and to listen opening statements. I think the atmosphere has changed quite a lot in WTO. So
thank you. And I would just ask if everyone would say your name and your affiliation, please.
My name is Jean-Pierre Raymond, and I'm the director of a climate action organization that is governmental and based here in Geneva. So I would like to come back to the carbon pricing. In my view, it's somehow a kind of silver bullet to get out of the situation we are in. And I would like to listen to the views of the different and distinguished panelists. Why carbon pricing is so important? First of all, and we should call it carbon pricing because it should not be considered as a tax, but as something that really structures the price. So first of all, it will generate the billions we need and we don't have to support all governments that are in need and public sector and also industries that have to change. Second, it will be fair because in my view, carbon pricing should be exponential. If you buy bread, you should not have the same level of rate as if you buy a private jet. And third, it will realign all the economy because there will be a clear incentive to produce more green products and to leave aside the ones that generate a lot of CO2. It's quite obvious. And finally, and I think this is the most important, as you know, the 10% on this planet produce 50% of CO2 emission, and the 50% of people on this planet produce less than 10%. And for the time being, there is no mechanism to change and to decouple this huge imbalance. So carbon pricing will make the change because the ones that can afford more will pay much, much more because the rate will be exponential, and the ones that have little will not pay at all because the tax will be extremely limited. So I would be happy to hear the views of the panel on this important issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Look, let's go to the next question there. Yep.
Good afternoon. Emily Desai. I'm the Deputy Director for International Affairs and Trade for the California Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. I'm very curious about this group's thoughts on what subnational governments can do to advance sustainability and trade. California, just this morning, Swiss time, our Governor Gavin Newsom announced he'll be traveling to China next month to talk about climate strategy and what our state can do. And obviously, in the absence of states or regions or provinces being able to set things like trade policy, we can, move forward incentives. 25% of new cars now sold in California are zero-emission vehicle, for example, as a result of those types of activities. So curious to hear about the role of subnational governments. Thank you.
Thank you. And then all the way in the back there, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. We've had a very interesting discussion. Is the panel aware that even if tariffs are reduced to zero, most of the developing countries would not have the foreign exchange to import green products and green technologies, which is partly on account of the high royalty payments which they would have to make on account of IP protection? I'm afraid the panel has really not given much consideration to the important role which IP protection plays as a barrier in accessing green technologies and green products in most developing countries. I would like to have the views of the panel on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's begin with Jean-Pierre's question about the carbon tax. We mentioned this a bit earlier, but maybe, Kirsten, we can go to you. How do you see this at WWF International? It does seem to have, as we heard, many very positive features to it, and it seems like if we could get carbon pricing right, it might allow the imbalances that exist in the world today to kind of self-correct.
I mean, definitely, I can be short. I think from WWF International, our position is that carbon pricing does play an important role. I think it can definitely help shift the emission reductions when it comes to transport, when it comes to the building sector, shipping sectors. But I also believe that it needs to sit, again, back to the conversation we had earlier, that it does need to sit in a broader set of measures that need to be taken. So I don't believe carbon pricing in itself is a silver bullet. I think it's a hugely important strategy, but we cannot ignore shifting the subsidies and tariffs that are harming and that are promoting climate change or harming biodiversity at the moment either. So yes, it's important as long as it sits within a broader set of measures that we take as governments to help shift the negative measures that exist away as well.
Yeah. I mean, these are in the end political economy questions.
Right.
And one benefit of carbon pricing, as Jean-Pierre explained, is that it does have the potential to generate resources, which can then be used to help address some of the imbalances that may be caused by reducing a current subsidy, for example. Go ahead, Jesper.
No, also sure from my side, I agree it's definitely a mechanism. And to a certain extent, of course, carbon pricing or taxation as such is being applied. We have seen through the decades that when the means generated are not used for the purpose, which is of course a bit of an issue with blunt taxation, it doesn't have the impact that it was supposed to. But I do believe it's one of the tools. I think if you look at the IKEA Scope 3 value chain, which is interesting because, of course, all companies and industries have different gravity of their carbon emissions and so forth. A lot of people would like to think that transport would be the biggest issue. It's not. It's actually one of the smaller portions of it. So in our value chain, it's now up to 50% of the carbon sits in material, so raw material. So again, you need to address, I think, in every industry and in every aspect, you need to be scientific in where you address your solutions. And again, carbon pricing will be good, but we need to do something much more radical. We need to speed up the incentivization in order to make investments come much sooner than I think taxation and blunt taxation would be. So again, I think we're looking at a portfolio of strategies and tactics.
Well, we have limited time, so I want to make sure we get to all of the questions. And unless someone had something they wanted to add on carbon pricing?
Just a quick one. That it's, I think it sums up all the comments. But it's we need to seriously take cooperation into account. It hasn't been mentioned, but I believe cooperation is one of the key elements that should drive a bigger force to climate change contribution. We have examples that have been working out very well here in the WTO. For example, in a trade facilitation agreement, we do have a mechanism for cooperation that is very well established and is very well managed, and there's resources from governments and from private sector and companies, and countries are classified on what about their needs. It should be taken into account. This mechanism works. The same mechanism has been taken into account into the investment agreement that we hoped that we have a clear venue on the next MC. And this should be taken into example also for the talks on the environmental and sustainability trades that we have forward. I think this sums up a little bit of the worries that the people have asked have shown up.
Well, I know you've had Governor Gavin Newsom on your stage before, and maybe California is an excellent example of this. But to the broader question from our colleague from California, is there a role for subnational governments? You know, they obviously don't necessarily fit normally in these kinds of venues, but in some cases, like in the case of California, they can be major forces. So what's the right way for us to think about subnational governments and their role here?
Like companies, they can form alliances and show the way. Of course, California is, if they broke away from the U.S., probably like the 10th largest economy in the world. So what happens in California means a lot. And their decision on EVs and taking the lead means a lot. But I also very much believe in those coalitions that are formed of municipalities, cities of the world, where they go forward and say, these are the standards we establish in our city. It's the only way. I started with saying that we, of course, should internalize the externalities. If something costs society a lot, of course, then you have to pay a price for that because you don't want it to continue. The challenge also is that for this to be effective, it needs to be a kind of a global consensus. There can be, like some countries can be first movers, some countries can come after. But if one country goes very far ahead, you will then see that industries and others don't invest in that country, and others say, oh, come to my country, I even have subsidies for this. So that's why I think this approach by coalitions is a good one, but we should not give up on what is common sense or should be common sense. But I'm really, I have to say, I'm pretty sad when I saw those numbers that countries are now subsidizing fossil fuel more than before. It's not that you then tax it, zero tax, but you then use taxpayers' money for making that more competitive than renewables. That is really doesn't make sense. Of course, maybe there is maybe people want this, and as the minister said, it's unpopular to then eradicate those subsidies, but the government doesn't have any money that doesn't get from its citizens. So maybe you can say, we will then eradicate all subsidies to oil and coal, but that money will be then invested with families, so you get like a check or something, and then you can use it. If you then use the check on fossil fuel, we cannot stop you from that. But if you then install a water pump, or if you have solar panels on your roof instead, at least you have a choice. I think we just have to think out of the box. At least we cannot then complain if we continue on that unsustainable path. We cannot complain that the planet is on fire.
And if there were ever a time for radical ideas, it's now. We're just about out of time, but I want to make sure we get to our colleague's critical question from the floor, saying that maybe we're missing the boat here when it comes to IP, that it is actually the key factor that will stop lower and middle income countries from having access to these technologies. Anyone want to take on that comment?
Well, again, I believe even if it should be an IP issue as well, not the only one, but one of the aspects, I think it needs to be brought up in a wider scope. We need to bring this to the table on tariffs also. We need cooperation, as I said before. We need to talk about how many standards we can achieve together. I mean, it's not only IP, but it's a set of things that I would, again, stress out that specifically for developing countries, it comes along with cooperation and talking in a wider spectrum. You need to also develop investment for your change on your energy sources in different countries. Like the minister said, for example, in the Caribbean, you will for sure need investment in the country. Investment needs to come with a good regulation, but also with good cooperation, and talk about also two keywords that come on this, that is value chains. And again, trade comes into this, and that's why we don't want to bring this out of the table. We need to take all the elements together to this objective.
Well, we're out of time, but maybe, Kisel, I wonder if you have a final thought to close us out?
Well, I would say that we should strive to have structured discussions on these issues, because as all of us have said in different ways, it's not a one-size-fits-all as it relates to the different areas that we've discussed. So on the issue of waivers and IP issues, at the WTO, we need to have the working groups on technology transfer looking at this issue. We have to have our committee on the environment look at these issues and keep speaking about them, and then we go from speaking to we actually seeing a manifestation of change, right? Because it's time for action.
It is time for action, and many of us will be next week in New York, where the headline will be that we're slipping behind on the Sustainable Development Goals. We're at the midway point, and things are getting worse, not better. And there's no chance, how will we ever get there by 2030? But what I'm taking away from this discussion, thinking as a journalist, what the headline is here, I think it is that there is a roadmap. There is a way forward. We've heard a number of ideas from the floor and from the stage that if we can think about trade and development and climate action as an interlinked set of issues, there is a way forward. We just need the political will to actually get there. So I want to ask you all to join me in thanking this fantastic panel and the WTO for hosting this discussion today.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that I so support what you were saying about